Welcome back to Face the Nation. It is time for some political analysis. Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor at National Review and a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Molly Ball is national political correspondent for Time magazine. David Sanger is a national security correspondent and senior writer for the New York Times. And Shawna Thomas is the Washington bureau chief for Vice News. Good to have you all here. There is such a real impact economically of the shutdown on communities. We're going to talk about that. I don't want to minimize it, but we are going to talk about the political winners and losers here, because in Washington, ultimately, that is what determines who's got the upper hand in a lot of this. Molly, the impression is that Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, won this round. What did she actually win here?
Well, she won on the substance. She got what she asked for basically at the beginning, which was to reopen the government and not to have any funding for the wall. I think she also won on the politics. We saw in public opinion polls that the approval ratings for Donald Trump took a turn downwards. The approval ratings for Nancy Pelosi took a turn upwards. And you wouldn't necessarily have known that at the beginning, right? I think the White House gambled that the Democrats would eventually feel that they had a political interest in not seeming to be stonewalling, but it really went the other way. The Democratic base and the Democratic caucus was very solidly in line with Speaker Pelosi's strategy and Minority Leader Schumer's strategy of not giving an inch, really. And that turned out to be a miscalculation by the White House, that the Democrats might eventually give in. And the result, I think, politically, is that the president was damaged, and the Democrats now are hoping that he won't want to go through that again, that he did on some level learn something from this.
You heard Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff, though, once again say they see splits among Democrats. You're saying that's not real.
I don't think it is. You have seen Democrats, as he said, expressing some openness to some border funding, potentially even wall funding. What they haven't said is that they disapproved of the strategy of the Democratic leaders, that they wouldn't have done it that way, and that they won't be behind that strategy again.
And one of our correspondents talked to the Virginia Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton. We also looked at a couple of town halls, and these are moderates who flipped districts. They're new members of Congress, where we thought we'd start to hear a little bit of, well, I mean, maybe we should come to the table with President Trump, maybe we should do this. And there were these people who sent these letters to Nancy Pelosi, these moderate Dems, saying, once the president reopens the government, we should have a conversation about the wall. But these people were not talking to us like people who were worried about losing Trump voters. Nancy Pelosi kept them in line, and she kept moderates in line.
So is the table set, though, for Democrats to now come forward with some kind of proposal? That seems to be what the White House is saying, that there's a moment of opportunity in these next 3 weeks.
I mean, I think there is a moment of opportunity. They have set these conferees. I think it's interesting that the Senate conferees, none of them come from actual border states. But I think we will see, and we'll see how these moderate Dems, as well as some of these really liberal people, deal with that now that they are actually doing something that resembles governing.
Yeah, but as Shawna mentioned, though, the most important thing is that the White House isn't part of this negotiation. That the thing that the president signed set up this committee between leaders in Congress to work this out. So the hope, I think, among Democrats and Republicans, is that if the White House stays out of this, they can work something out among themselves.
Ramesh, you hear the speculation, though, that in the next 3 weeks, the president may revisit his decision not to declare an emergency or, not to shut the government down again, because he's going to get hit so hard by conservative commentators. Is he going to pay a cost?
I think he is. I think, look, everything he's done in this entire fight has been born of weakness and has begotten more weakness. He went to the shutdown in the first place because he was getting criticized by part of his base, because he was getting criticized from Ann Coulter. So he picked this fight, and then he lost it. Is he going to be willing to sit through several weeks of coverage of how he's lost and how he's shown himself to be weak? Or is he going to want to? Is that going to motivate him to shut the government down again? I think that it would be a totally irrational decision that would not achieve his objectives. That doesn't mean he won't do it.
David, you hear the president who campaigned on this idea of the forgotten men and women, the everyday people. And he's been a champion of them. But they are, in many ways, as Senator Manchin said, the people paying the cost, not the elected officials who still get their paycheck. Does this, branding-wise hurt the president? Can he still say that he's a champion for these folks?
Margaret, I think it hurts him on two levels. The first is his cabinet appeared to be completely tone deaf when it came to the price that was being paid by ordinary federal workers. And the height of it coming when his Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, suggested that people go out and get payday loans, basically, because the government wasn't paying them. So what have they missed in this? First, the human cost, which I think has been documented pretty remarkably. Secondly, the government cost. We're now paying people, rightly so, we have to pay them, for work that wasn't done while 40–50% of the government was shut. And third, and I think perhaps the most important, was the strategic cost. It really revealed, apart from the president's sort of uselessness of the exercise, it revealed an inability by this administration to prioritize about what are true security threats. Think of what Mick Mulvaney said to you. He said the president takes seriously takes security as the nation as his highest priority. Well, on Tuesday, his intelligence chiefs are going to go out and do that annual exercise of laying out the security threats to the country, right, in an unclassified briefing. If it's like the past 5 years, cyber's number one, terrorism's number two, nuclear proliferation, rise of China, aggressiveness by Vladimir Putin, you get to border issues around page 14 of last year's, and yet he has spoken very little about the others.
There's also a point about political prioritization and the failure of the administration to make a strategic plan. I do think that the prominence of the border wall promise in Trump's 2016 campaign means he really does have to show that he's made progress on it. He had a chance to do that. Last year, when the Senate Democrats offered him legalization of illegal immigrants who came here as minors in return for some progress on the wall, he threw that chance away because he overreached, he wanted too much. And it's not clear that he's going to get that chance again. I don't know if I'm a congressional Democrat looking at these negotiations coming up, I'm going to say I need to give this president anything now that he's lost.
Molly, we are in the 2020 campaign season now. Ignore the calendar that says 2019. And both sides, Democrats and Republicans, seem to like campaigning around the issue of immigration. Is there an incentive, if you're ultimately cynical here, is there an incentive not to solve it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, this has been a persistent accusation, I think, by both sides, is that it means more to politicians as a sort of live political issue that they can arguably demagogue than as something and use to get their voters out than as something that they actually want to do. I think that's not the primary thing standing in the way of a broader immigration reform deal. I mean, it's been a decade and more that a lot of politicians in both parties have been trying to forge a grand bargain on immigration and have failed to do so. And there's all kinds of obstacles to it that I don't think are just related to this particular political season. I do think, though, that the 2018 midterms were very eye-opening for both sides about the resonance of the immigration issue. You had Republicans wanting to make that election about the economy. The White House overruled them. The president was much more interested in the issue of the caravan and in talking about immigration and talking about the wall and talking about crime. The Republicans lost big, except in some of those rural state Senate races. And so I think what both parties took away from that, and the shutdown was the same way. You had a lot of opinion polls showing that people cared much more about kitchen table issues than about this idea of a dangerous caravan approaching the border. Even if that were true, even if people believed that was a serious problem that needed to be solved, they didn't think it was as important as their salary, their local economy, the things that affect them on an everyday level. And so I think that politicians on both sides are seeing that lesson.
But the question that I think we're all sort of dancing around is that if the Democrats have made this idea of a wall or still slats or parts of a wall or whatever I'm supposed to be saying now in a moral issue, and that it is immoral, how do they give in on some parts of that? And can Nancy Pelosi kind of get herself out of that issue? Because I don't think the president of the United States is going to back down on having some parts of the wall funded.
And Manchin sort of pointed that direction when and so did Susan Collins by saying it's part of something. It's the president himself who needs to call all of it a wall, as he's told his own aides.
Well, we will take a break and talk about everything else that happened here in Washington in just a moment. Stay with us. We're back now with more from our political panel. David, I want to start with you here. You know, speaking of national security issues, the broader question of this probe into Russian interference in the 2016 election and the Mueller investigation, I think people often get overwhelmed by the number of headlines that they see about it. How should we understand the indictment of Roger Stone this week?
Well, first, there's just the stunning number of people around the campaign, some of whom moved into the White House, most of whom didn't, who have been indicted or have pled guilty. We ran a big graphic in the Times that showed basically over 100 contacts between people in the campaign and Russians, which is a big change from what the White House was saying early in its time, which was no one in the campaign dealt with anybody in Russia, period. The second big thing that came out of the Roger Stone indictment, though, was in one pregnant paragraph that was buried away in the indictment, written in the very passive tense, in which Special Counsel Mueller said that a Trump campaign official contacted someone else in the campaign, didn't say who, to ask Mr. Stone about any additional releases and damaging information that would come out from WikiLeaks. What does that tell you? They didn't name who these campaign officials were. Clearly, Mueller has in mind who they are, or he wouldn't have put them there. And that is the closest they've gotten to describing something that they could charge was a conspiracy. And that, of course, is the charge that the president is most worried about, along with obstruction of justice. What we don't know is, did the president himself know about these requests to get information from WikiLeaks?
Will we find out who those senior campaign officials are? I know Roger Stone has said Steve Bannon is at least one of them.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of questions about who was directing
second
this.
one, or I guess more than second one. I mean, I was also struck by the fact that officials was plural, Trump campaign officials. Bannon has been identified through various, like when you start to connect the dots, you're like, oh, one Steve Bannon. But that is the question everyone else has. Who are the other officials who were having some kind of conversations with Roger Stone to try to get WikiLeaks to do something? Mm-hmm. I think the thing that is clear, and Susan Collins kind of said this to you as well, is that here's one problem, and everyone who has talked to the House Intelligence Committee, everyone who has talked to the Senate Intelligence Committee is now thinking maybe lying to Congress is a bad idea since Mueller is really using that, and he's used it with Cohen, he's used it with Stone. That is putting pressure on people, and if you are one of the other many people who's talked to the committees, you're probably going through your testimony and wondering if the FBI is going to knock on my door.
Because of those numbers, Ramesh, it's harder and harder to say which hunt.
That's right. So the bar keeps changing, and the current line is, well, there's no proof of criminal collusion by Trump, by his campaign, and Russia, whereas previously it's like, you know, there was no cooperation at all, and that line keeps shifting. One question that's, I think, raised by this that's kind of interesting is, why is there no campaign finance charge against Roger Stone? Earlier phases of the scandal have seen speculation that, for example, Donald Trump Jr. might be vulnerable to a legal charge that he solicited politically useful information from Russia. And is this illegal? So the question is, are they holding that in reserve against Stone? Have they decided that that charge doesn't legally stand up because there are First Amendment issues that come into play? But I gotta imagine that Donald Trump Jr.'s lawyers are poring over this pretty carefully.
Or is that so monumental that Mueller isn't going to do that until the very end?
Well, that's right. He could be holding
charging the president's son, which I know we're all thinking that, but charging the president's son would be a really huge deal.
And I think the other thing that's notable, too, is that Nancy Pelosi tweeted about Roger Stone, but she waited until right after the president had signed the deal to reopen the government. That was obviously done on purpose, and she took a very strong line, much stronger than I think she's taken in the past, taking the administration to task for all of this stuff. And I think that's really a sign of things to come, as much as the shutdown battle was, right? In this battle between Trump and the newly empowered speaker, the Democratic speaker, the shutdown was kind of a distraction from what we were all expecting the Democratic Congress to start doing, which is start using their power, not just for subpoenas, but especially to hold public hearings and really try to put these pieces together for the public and get to the bottom of a lot of the same things that Mueller's investigating.
David, I want to make sure we explain what's going on with the Trump administration's decision to pick a side in Venezuela.
Yeah.
People often say if you pick a side, make sure that side wins. The interim president now, who the U.S. is putting its weight behind, how does this all get resolved? Does Maduro actually step down?
Well, we're right at the precipice right now where Maduro's only supporters are China, Russia, and Cuba. Not a great collection. The Europeans have indicated that if Maduro does not call for a true and fair election, because he fixed the last one, within 8 days, they too will go with Juan Guaido, who is the interim president as declared by the parliament, the one the United States has backed. I think the interesting news here is there has been bipartisan support behind the president's decision to support Juan Guaido. I think the problem here is both history and inconsistency. Our history in Latin America of intervening is a pretty ugly one, and the inconsistency of not applying the same standards to places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where the president has embraced strongmen, I think may come back to make the United States look pretty hypocritical, not for the first time.
Right. And potentially some political cost in Florida.
Well, that's right. The other interesting question, though, is the anti-interventionist base of this president in particular among Republicans. How do they react to this role that we're now playing in Venezuela? Elliot Abrams had been blackballed by the administration when he was going to be brought on as the number 2 in the State Department early in the administration. Now he's the special envoy.
Interesting to watch. We'll be back in a moment to have a conversation with 2 mayors, both from cities very much affected by the government shutdown.